dig deeper in your writing, and so I'm really happy to share enthusiasm in thinking of Benjamin. And Benjamin will meditate around Earth layers, right?
Earth layer, yeah, right, yeah. So thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation to join you. I just got off the plane from California actually a few minutes ago, so it's lovely to be here in this yoga-like setting we have. So yes, as Boris mentioned, the topic ostensibly for this remarks that are prepared tonight is the Earth layer, and the black, as I'll talk a little bit about, this Black Stack essay was in eFlux was an excerpt from the conclusion chapter of a book that's coming out in the fall from MIT Press called The Stack on Software and Sovereignty. And the book is looking at the way in which planetary scale computation both deforms and distorts the traditional Westphalian model of the nation state and produces new territories in its own image. It also argues that instead of thinking about all these various types of planetary scale computation, smart grids, cloud computing, smart cities, Internet of Things, and so forth, as so many different genres or species of computing all sort of spinning out on their own, it's possible and perhaps even necessary to think of them as forming something like a accidental megastructure, something that takes the form not unlike software and hardware stack. And so the book deals with the layers of this stack. And based on the essay that I wrote for the Rare Earth exhibition, I wanted to extend some of these remarks around the question of Earth, computing, Earth, planets, and what it means to think about planetary scale computation in terms of the planet itself. And I hope that in a way, however dark it may seem, that my remarks are taken as optimistic, which is really what they should be. There's a dynamic between natural computation on the one hand, expressing itself through artificial computing machines, and those same machines in turn remaking the world, each bending and counter-simulating itself awkwardly and incompletely in the other. So the Earth layer of this accidental megastructure of planetary scale computation, what I call the stack, is shaped by this irregular and perhaps unsustainable interplay between the one and the other. Sensing, drawing, enumerating, consuming, effecting. And so while it would be a mistake to imagine computation as something that just sprung into existence with the rise of computing machines, or as the superimposition of some synthetic layer on top of everything organic and analogous and ultimately separate from natural algorithmic processes, it's also wrong to imagine computation as existing on some dry virtual plane sealed off from the wet economies of energy, water, arbitrary valuation, remote capture, and geographic chance. So, irrespective of the mathematical limits of algorithmic reason, the stack is interested instead in the limited and specific compositional capacities of a megastructure already under construction, the thresholds of which are geologic, sociological, economic, chemical, and geopolitical, as much as they are calculative. So here, the Earth is a layer in a synthetic machine. And for this, the Earth is the Earth, a physical planet, not some metaphor for nature. Because there is of course, no planetary scale computation. Now, a vast network of many billions of little Turing machines that does not intake and absorb the Earth's chemistry in order to function. The stack is a hungry machine, and while its curated population of algorithms may be all but massless, their processing of earthly material are physical events. And therefore the range of possible translations between information and mechanical appetites has another limit that's not defined, that's not mathematical, but defined by the real finitude of substances, which can force communication between both sides of this encounter. This is made clear by, I think, by unpacking and sifting through the hardware on which the stack depends. Silicon is far from the only important substance required in its manufacturing and its maintenance, and the economies of its assembly are far from crystalline. The stack's need for more exotic elements is intense, and even relatively mundane consumer electronics and cloud tethers, aka phones, contain dozens of different minerals and metals sourced from every continent. Some crucial metals are drawn largely from rich and vulnerable mines in Central Africa. In the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, big chunks and little pebbles of tantalum or coltan, cassiterite or tin, wolframite or tungsten, and gold are pulled by hand from cold, sludgy mountain rivers, often by children, and eventually make their way into the device component supply chain. 2009, a few mines here produced 13% of the world's mined coltan, and inert metal used in the ubiquitous little tiny capacitors, especially for cell phones. And from this same land, the Belgians once took ivory, the Americans cobalt, and now billions of earthlings everywhere carry little bits of Africa around with them in their pockets. The financial rewards of mining and trading in electronics has contributed to devastating effects in the region, including overlapping civil wars in Congo and in Rwanda. From 1998 to 2003, upwards of 5 million people died in the Congolese Civil War, making it, by one measure, at least the deadliest conflict since World War II. And the extraction and export of minerals, both legal and illegal, has been controlled and taxed by competing mafias and militias. And away from the relative stability of the cities, these groups continue to terrorize local populations and to use the proceeds of this export trade to finance ongoing wars over local territorial position. The smoldering conflict is a war partially financed with the manufacturing capital of smartphones and laptops. Inevitably, the smooth skin of the device demands gore to feed its gloss. Deforestation in the pursuit of new sources of coltan in remote areas populated by gorillas, G-O-R, has also led to an increase in the trade and consumption of bushmeat, the quasi-cannibal economy that parallels the symbolic cannibalism of the widespread war crimes in nearby villages. Exported minerals are sent to smelting companies, mostly in China, India, Thailand, Malaysia, where they are mixed with metals sourced from the world over, Australia and Brazil, the other major sources of coltan. More recently, these conflict minerals as a cause has taken its place among other coneyisms, and potentially effective legislation has been passed, including in the US, that requires electronic manufacturers to better police their own supply chains. The most heinous circumstances are the most allegorically rich. But even absent the anarchic brutality of these wars and the Conradian odor of campaigns against them, the lesson is more global. There is no stack without a vast immolation and involution of the Earth's mineral cavities. The stack terraforms the host planet by drinking and vomiting its elemental juices and spitting up mobile phones. After its short career as a little computing brick within a larger mega machine, its fate at the dying end of the electronics component life cycle is just as sad. What is called electronic waste inverts the process that pulls entropic reserves of metal and oil from the ground and given form, and instead partially disassembles them and reburies them, sometimes a continent away and sometimes right next door. Minerals originally sourced from the Congo might make their way to California via China before being pulled by hand from a dead phone and burned or buried in Agbogbloshie, Ghana, or Lagos, Nigeria, two of the most active repositories, just a short way from their original source. So I want to shift then the topic a little bit to that of measurement and modeling, the production of models of measurement and the measurement of models. That is because the Earth is not only what the stack is made out of, the Earth itself is one of the primary objects that its governing knowledge seeks to observe. That is, the stack becomes a means by which some chemical ecologies of matter assemble themselves in order to govern other chemical ecologies of matter. By computational platforms, then, geography, geology, and geodesy converge into interlocking information infrastructures assigned to sensing biochemical reserves, abstracting their measure and status, and in turn providing a recursive medium for their governance. But the weight and appetite of that simulation, too, distorts and eats what it models. Such geographies, stack geographies, both complicate and clarify the design of what we call platform sovereignty, as much for what they make possible as for what they disrupt. So Google's motto, to organize the world's information and to make it universally accessible and useful, changes meaning when the world itself is seen as being information, such that to organize all the information is to organize all the world. Furthermore, synthetic computation expands what it is that can be sensed and measured and calculated and communicated and stored and worked upon. That is, the ascendance of digital computing from a narrowly deployed elite scientific military instrument into a general purpose planetary scale consumer infrastructure also transforms what states and other systems of governance can see, what they can know, what they can affect, and it transforms those thereby into organs of organizational cognition. So as sensing extends to all specific surfaces, no longer dumb, but rather now affective, the net sum of what is opened up or closed off by computation largely defines what it is that any governance platform now chooses to sense and not sense in general. The information that is sensed and sensible is more often than not on the surfaces of the territory, intensifying governmental focus on these surfaces. Now, skin is, of course, the largest sensory organ on any animal body, composed of multiple dermal and epidermal layers, holding organs together on the inside, mediating multiple layers of individual interiority and exteriority. And the extrapolation of planetary surfaces as being a kind of epidermis has been inextricably linked with the conceptualization of climate measurement and prediction. Global climate and weather systems have long been a driving application for planetary instrumentation and the understanding of the globe as a, quote, vast machine. The interdependence between the image of infrastructure and the infrastructure of the image that these systems produce is exemplified then as a kind of systems logic of a geographic, bioinformational, planetary scale, epidermal sensing and computation megastructure. By who else? The Planetary Skin Institute. For this project, the Planetary Skin Institute, that is, the living and breathing geoepidermis is surveyed through a proposed meta-instrumentation of the biosphere into a kind of totally available archived present, open to interested intervention, collaborative management, and quantified governance. Originally launched cooperatively in 2009 by NASA and Cisco, and now independent nonprofit research and development platform, Planetary Skin sought to integrate data from many sources into a single branded geo-administrative mechanism. An internal Cisco white paper described Planetary Skin as, quote, an open network platform for real-time, highly distributed mass remote sensing, authentication, risk profiling, certification, and monitoring of carbon stocks and flows that generates trust and enables collaboration between actors in all three sectors, industry, government, academia, close quote. Its ultimate ambition, then, is to provide an open, comprehensive, multi-constituent platform for monitoring and governing planetary, biological, ecological systems, with particular emphasis on water distribution and carbon quantification. Ultimately, we assume to support pricing of these as reserve currencies. One early pilot project of Planetary Skin is called Rainforest Skin, which would measure the total quantity of carbon contained within the planet's rainforests, perhaps the most immediately leverageable carbon governance opportunity, and where CO2 sinks are concentrated but threatened by land use. The project would combine data sets from, quote, geo-referenced satellites, unmanned aerial vehicles, and multiple ground-based sensor networks to estimate the forest carbon stock and flow dynamics so as to allow for trading and risk management of this new commodity, close quote. Now, stack scale initiatives such as Planetary Skin, and there are many others. HP has called the Trillion Sensor World, Sense with a C, the planetary central nervous system, they call it. These frame the totality of Earth at once, and so as to identify and track strategic chemical subroutines, such as carbon flows, and to prevent these totalities back to the whole. This sort of speculative mega computation is but one way that the geoscopy, geography, and geopolitics blur and blend into amalgamated images and territories and governmental techniques. And it's but one way that the stack composes the Earth layer. The Planetary Skin's tagline is, "You can't monitor what you can't measure." It's a good motto for the big data society, should it ever be clarified at some point in the process who is and isn't you. As Planetary Skin describes it, you are likely drawn from the usual stakeholders of technocrats, academics, NGOs, consultants, and so on. The likely effect of this infrastructure, however, were it or something like it ever to be fully realized, would not merely extend or consolidate the arrangement of zero-sum governance as we currently know it, but would inevitably introduce other compound subjects and objects, some human and some not, and elevate them from object to subject in uncertain ways. A benefit of these initiatives would not only be the quantification of a status quo, but ultimately to break ground for alternative norms and to constitute, or at least support, another medium of governance over the biosystems that we, quote unquote, can measure and monitor. Planetary Skin or some similar descendant platform might connect with existing governmental and non-governmental biopolitical authorities, supporting, augmenting, superseding them, and through ecumenic platform interoperability would itself ultimately become a governing authority. Through these neutral, quote unquote, simulations, a visualization of ground level patterns upon which any large scale carbon trading markets would depend is this, a platform like this one that could quantify carbon stocks that might be traded or sequestered, as well as to validate treaty verifications and violations. This would in turn help to turn matter into money by providing a kind of financial transparency of this, in this case, of financialized molecules. Such platform projects are emblematic of the stack's incorporation of the Earth as a layer in that they would convene political authority not by starting from scratch, but by remeasuring it, by reframing and re-instrumentalizing some already existing geographic whole. They generate comprehensive quantifications of processes and patterns which, to the extent that they operate as intended, also take on an effective force of law within an expanded eco-political jurisdiction, even if their claims are not formally ratified by states, Westphalian or post-Westphalian, to do so. Further, as these meta-technologies of ecological observation become necessary to even perceive the contours of ecological risk, they enter directly into the programmatic center of governance as such. This is not internationalism, however. The force of the platforms works differently. For example, from the kind of, quote, eco-globalism feared by conspiratorial isolationists the world over, all spit-a-lipped over Agenda 21, in that there is not, according to design at least, no central commanding body outside of the architecture of the platform itself. Such platforms in principle may even work, for better or worse, to undermine forms of political centralization that they themselves do not or cannot calculate or articulate. That said, nothing is certain. A transference of sovereignty from the declared self-interest of whoever counts as a citizen into the calculation of carbon and energy binds one inhale to another exhale across continents, and so guarantees, at the very least, indecipherable accounting paradoxes. Computation, you see, is training governance to see the world as it does and to be blind like it is. If, over time, something sees for the state, on behalf of the state, and in place of the state, it does so by seeing as a state, or by seeing as something the state has not yet become, but would become once it is trained by those same new tools of perception and blindness. As the state involves new techniques into itself, those techniques also absorb, displace, and diminish the state by controlling access to unique jurisdictions that the state cannot otherwise possibly comprehend without their help. While it extends jurisdictionality, the stack also confiscates and multiplies it. It doesn't merely accelerate or open up governance as presently configured, it invents substitutions. As alternate jurisdictions appear, some linking cellular biology to macroecologies to computational geopolitics, some enduring for seconds, others perhaps for many centuries. Macroscopic platforms such as Planetary Skin frame the Earth as that competitive archive, sorted into a quantifiable past, an atemporal, surficial now, and a predictive virtualization of its futures from which models and simulations, its preferred instruments of governance, can be derived. And through this, opacity and privacy are redefined by a spectacle of transparency. As the platform's authority is based on the quantity and quality of its data and from the means to translate that stash into instrumental simulations of error-corrected pasts, presents, and futures. From Cisco, NASA, Google, etc., data are available for free or on a subscription basis and provided with an invitation to innovate vertical markets with their data sets and tools. Geoepidermal megastructures such as these realize their political value through the immediate and potential events they can sense, and the economic value through the currencies that they can verify for their users. And so they are themselves dependent on enabling users to actively engage with their platform interfaces and to act back upon the materials that they represent. That is, platforms are machines as well as maps, and engines as well as cameras, and tools to compose things, not just to measure them. And so the slogan, "You can't monitor what you can't measure," may need to be revised to also include the Foucauldian line, "You can't modify what you can't monitor," or rather, you can't not modify whatever it is that you can sense. It's important, I think, when we think about these kinds of systems, this massive instrumentalization of the planet in relationship to climate change, for example, It's important to also keep in mind that the only reason we actually know climate change is happening to the degree and granularity and specificity that we know is because of this these instruments of monitoring and measurement that are there. The weight of this instrumentation, the weight by which this machine bears down on its own planet, notwithstanding. An example, I think, sort of brought this home to me was the contradiction of this, if you like, or the paradox of this. Is like I was on a panel with a guy named Stanley Williams, who's a chip scientist at HP. He designs chip cores. And he was talking about, as a bit of an aside on his paper, which was about something else. He was talking an aside where he had was on a panel convened by the Department of Energy at the behest of then Vice President Al Gore, to try to come up with a computer. What would it take to architect a computer that would be capable of monitoring and simulating the entire planetary climate in real time? What such a machine, what would we need to actually build this kind of machine? What would it even look like? The group concluded that this would require zeta flop computing. That is a system capable of 10 to the 21 floating point operations per second. And at the time, the fastest supercomputers are measured in about 10 to the 15, and on-tap exaflops, or 10 to the 18, was still years away. Now, so Williams discussed that it would be possible that with zeta flop computing, it would theoretically be possible to do so with a different kind of processing architecture than one necessarily built on silicon transistors, built instead with photonics, nano switches, hybridized with silicon, so forth and so on, that would make this work. Nanoscale wires and the rest of this. So he concludes a bit anticlimactically that the conclusion of the group's report was that the computer that was requested could in fact be built, but based on a future projection of what the available technology might be in the next decade or so, it would be roughly the size of Paris, and it would itself be the single largest anthropogenic climatic event that it itself would be modeling, because it would take so much energy to run the thing. And so, short of fundamental breakthroughs, this anecdote underscored for me this paradoxical recursivity that undergirds the demand for a kind of global ecological omniscience on the one hand, and the cost and appetite of an accidental megastructure on the other. It's a bit like the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. We have to build the smart grid fast enough to save us from the climatic costs of industrialization, but building the grid may in fact be the thing that tips us over the edge that makes this possible. And so do we build it, we have to build it faster, or do we have to not build it at all? And it's this is the dilemma. So we expect complementary and contradictory effects. This may resituate computational technology closer to its elemental origins. It may suggest alternative geoengineering projects as the critical design program. It may suggest less a virtual chemistry of reserve currencies, inaugurate a new sovereignty for sensation. It may sponsor the construction of a global metrical megastructure that is forever weighing its own girth and imposition, a smart grid eating its own tail, as I say. And it's harder, I think, to decide these questions than it should be, really. I think part of the language that we use from various disciplines, from arts, design, engineering, philosophy, is inadequate to the task in a certain way. And so just to pick on two groups, Heideggerians and singularitarians, two groups with which I think have more in common than they realize, and with whom I have ongoing frustrations, I think have made it more difficult to talk about species and technology in a productive way. They have made, I think, the inevitable, whether we want to do it or not, geoengineering project that really constitutes eco-geopolitics for the 21st century into something that is either disqualified a priori as a metaphysical atrocity, that is for the Heideggerians, or something that will simply sort itself out by the invisible hand of Moore's law, the singularitarians. It's their fetishes, or on the one hand, it's a fetishization of human experience, the Heideggerians, obviously, or the psychotic promotion that the self is a stable physical entity that can be expanded exponentially without exploding into fractal plurality for the other, obviously the singularitarians. Both of these, I think, make it far too difficult to see geoengineering, or better, just geodesign, a project for what it should be, something more like molecular gastronomy at landscape scale, a restored and or resorted ecology designed to taste itself in new forms of richly spiced and sauced mutual ingestion. Consider that one side effect of NASA's unmanned programs, from the 60s all the way through the 70s and 80s, particularly the Viking probes that went to the surface of Mars, are an example of what Kim Stanley Robinson, science fiction writer, calls comparative planetology. That is the consideration of patterns of differences among astronomical bodies. Arguably, the leverage of this kind of perspective, a comparative planetological perspective, is greater than that, should be greater than that of the iconic visual knowledge that the Apollo Earthrise or Blue Marble photographs provided, which would demonstrate, yes, the formal coherency of the Earth as a geophysical unit, but now the special singularity of that unit can be measured by variation as well among like and unlike cousins, each of which represents an alternative chemical reality from which or toward which our own perch might be distinguished and interpreted. And seen from this outside, the Earth layer of the stack then is not only the plateau from which emerges the material and energy to run the other layers of the stack, it's also in essence the basis of a second planetary computer, one laid on top of the first, that first system whose calculations already resulted in the relative ecological and chemical stability of our planetary situation. Now, often pervasive computing is talked about as in terms of kind of diagnosis model, providing us with a way to detect pathologies. We detect pollution in one way or another and then render it. It's a way to visualize the invisible evil, drawing a picture so we can see where it goes and where it is in one way or another to prevent it from ever happening again. But the maximal design image of pervasive computation, this second planetary computer, is more than that. It's more than a smearing of the planet's surface with objective computational film that would construct a stream of information about the performance of our spaces. Rather, what would emerge then, in the political formations that potentially emerge are based instead on encounters and relationships between persons and things and material events, especially those in which people are not directly involved. But even if everything is seen and registered, not everything sees or works back upon what it sees in the same way. Part of the design question then has to do with the status of the image of that world that is created by that second computer, as well as of the image itself and the way that it governs a planet, by governing its model of that planet. That model of the material public is built largely on the interrelationship of non-human actors, but so the images that the designer can deduce and produce serve to give a kind of representational agency to a material matrix that otherwise would be invisible to itself beyond the most local of chemical interactions. So the status of the non-human human relation to the designer, considered in terms of emergent models of software and sovereignty, conjoins sensing, sense-making, and image-making into a kind of generic infrastructure of sensors, databases, displays, firmware in the wild. In other words, a stacked system that both reflects and congeals what it represents, both technically and politically. The columns going up and down the paths link a politics that we are capable of seeing to a politics capable of seeing us. And through it, one becomes the other. It compiles a diagnostic image, diagramming present and potential relationships between agents within its line of sight. And we assume that any human or non-human component's ability to recognize and consume that image, and thereby also consume the projection of a set of potential governable relationships between variables within that interface, does so not just for utilitarian imperatives, but with real affective intensity. In this utility and intensity, another proposition is made about how it is that we may sense the world, or how the sensibility of the world might be distributed or organized, made infrastructural, and activated to become a part of how the landscape understands and narrates itself. It's not only then an image, it's also a tool for a politics that doesn't yet exist, emerging from the parametric multiplication and algorithmic conjugation of our surplus of projections of images, interfaces to come, perhaps in some mimetic accordance with one explicit utopian conception or another, perhaps not. Nevertheless, what is and is not governable, and how it is not to be governed, may arise as much from what the model computational image cannot do as from what it can. Its effects are as reliant upon stockpiles of failures as upon capacities for success. This is no less true of the surplus of interfacial images, of interfacial utopias that constitute the affect of information visualization than it is for the parliamentary politics of an agrarian time, one that persisted long enough to provide funding for those Vikings' missions to Mars. So, last point. What comes after the Anthropocene? The only thing we really can know about what we might call the post-Anthropocene is that it would be an era in which humans are no longer the dominant geologic actor. This new Earthling species may prove, some new Earthling species, who knows, may prove to be more fit, better at making the next evolutionary steps than we humans are. And so for us to survive, we may have to become more like them and less like what we are now. In the longer view, humans' role may be that of an enabling intermediary between early primates on the one hand and as yet to come phyla that blend organic and inorganic flesh and thinking. This is the point of convergence, perhaps, between robust artificial intelligence and the deep ecologies of voluntary human extinction. Instead of disappearing, however, we survive by perforating the boundaries between animal, vegetable, and mineral. Alternatives, however, prop up a psychotic misrecognition of what humans, humanity, and humanism actually are. We are the brain-eating apes with weaponized hydrogen atoms who organize our societies according to Bronze Age poetry on human sacrifice and ritual purification. Among the last projects to support is rehumanization, in any sense of a direct return to historical norms. I think the other species, animal, vegetable, and especially mineral, would agree. Thank you. See? So if we want to have a little discussion, I'd be happy to talk a little bit if you want, whatever you want.
You accept Q&A?
Of course.
Okay, so
Yeah.
if there are any questions?
You didn't touch upon the question of time. I was wondering if this idea of step, is it linked, does it have a corresponding temporal order? How is kind of geo-time then related to social time, or even the cultural model of historicity
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. It's dealt with in a little bit more, developed more in the Earth Layer chapter and more in the conclusion. The question of deep time, geologic time, particularly in relationship to some of the themes at the end of this, of AI and the rest of this, is more a focus of the book that I'm writing now, this as well. The stack is definitely, it's a synchronic system, there's no doubt. It's a model, yeah? It's built as a synchronic model. It's understood as a sort of it's a borrowing of a specific kind of technical model from, essentially from computer science, the OSI, TCP/IP stack of corresponding component modular layers, and using this as a kind of diagrammatic understanding for how we might think about a megastructural system as opposed to, you know, a smaller level machine. One of the question of futurity is built into this model, however, not necessarily the kind of deep time that we really want to be talking about, but at least the question of futurity in that it's a model that is set up with the presumption that unexpected and unexpectable innovations will appear, and that whatever the system that is deployed now must be able to accommodate them with the least amount of interference. And so anything that exists on one layer of the stack could be any type of machine, could be pulled out and another put in, and as long as it abides by the protocols by which it can talk to the layer above it and talk to the layer below it, it could be almost anything. And so that's how we can pull copper wire, twisted pair copper wire out and put in fiber optic at a physical layer, TCP/IP for example, and everything stays the same. And so the good news is that stacks are designed to be completely replaced. It's a bit like Theseus paradox, where take the boat you may have heard it more like George Washington's axe. Like this is the original axe that George Washington chopped down the cherry tree with. We of course we had to replace the handle twice and the head 3 times, but it occupies the same space. Yeah, this is Theseus paradox. Stacks are basically built on this principle that in order for them to work properly, the stack that we have inevitably is replaced by a stack to come, bit by bit by bit by bit. And so while it is posited as a kind of figure of an interpretive totality, it's not frozen, it's not fixed. It's in fact made to be replaced, which is a different kind of futurity as well. But yeah, another just kind of. Yeah, please.
What is the place of human consciousness in the stack?
Well, probably not very much. One of the nice things about being at UC San Diego is that it's one of the great places for neuroscience in the church, and also in the philosophy department. It's a very neurophilosophical place. So I've gotten to know a little bit more about neuroscience than I had intended to, which is great, which I'm really very happy to do. Consciousness, I don't think, from what we really know, consciousness is not nearly as an important part of how it is that we do what we do, what our brains do, and how we get around the world than we may have thought it is. This sort of part of our brain that does this level of self-reflexivity isn't perhaps so important or so special. And so I'd be hesitant from the get-go to hang too much on it as an idea, right? I'm certainly allergic to any of the kinds of Deepak Chopra sorts of anti-materialist views of consciousness as constituting some kind of fifth element like love or any of this kind of stuff. One of the interesting things I think, I said the next book is on AI. One of the things that I think where some of the neuroscience and AI overlap in I think in some interesting ways is an understanding of how it is that you can have incredibly intelligent systems that do very complex, nuanced, responsive things without any level of self-reflexivity or consciousness whatsoever. And so there's a piece you may be interested in, an op-ed that I published in the New York Times a couple months ago about the Turing test. And I was arguing about why it is that we need to get away from Turing test models of AI. The idea that we will grant that some synthetic intelligence exists, or that it is in fact intelligent to the extent to which it appears to think like the way we think, which is what Turing tests basically are, is philosophically, ethically, and just practically indefensible. What I'm interested in this regard is the way in which a further development within AI will eventuate in different forms and genres and conditions of intelligence that we will have to negotiate with and come in contact with. That what philosophy calls the other mind problem of how it is that you're able to conceptualize how a mind that's very different than your own possibly can think. Tchaikovsky's Solaris is all built on the other mind problem, where the alien tries to figure out how to talk to these little humans or 2001 for that matter. Yeah? I think as we get surrounded more and more by different kinds of synthetic intelligence that are not human, that are inhuman, that are variously will pretend to be human on our behalf at different points in time, that the robustness with which we have ability to deal with those kinds of what I take to be really ethical negotiations between different kinds of forms of intelligence will be much more important, and at a political level, at ethical level, even at an infrastructural level as well. I think in this sense, we probably have as much to learn from AI about what thinking is as AIs have to learn from us of what thinking is, as we begin to understand thinking as something that exists within a much broader, heterogeneous continuum. And so, without knowing where the real gist of your question would go, I would be hesitant to think about human consciousness as being something that is any kind of central measure, especially the way the probably folk inadequacies by which we think about it. I mean, one of the basic premises of what's called limited materialism in neuroscience is the idea that the way in which that we don't really know how our brains work. The brain itself is trying to figure out how brains work, and it doesn't really know yet. And it's invented these kinds of metaphors like thought and memory and self and idea, which have very little material chemical correspondent to what brain works, and will, in time, essentially, that these terms we'll deduce that they are kind of folk concepts, astrological, in their sort of taking this as well. And so, yeah. Yeah, please.
Don't you think the idea of skin itself could even resolve itself?
I think it's going to. I don't know. I think it will actually become an earlier idea of skin as something that's simply a dumb membrane, a sort of a barrier point between inside and outside. I think will go away. But I think part of this is because skins themselves are becoming so much more intelligent or active in different kinds of ways, both because there's so much governing in the Foucauldian sense, governing attention played on the skin as a site of interest. I think an argument can be made if you think of Deleuze's Society of Control essay, for example, where he talks about the shift between a Foucauldian disciplinary society and Deleuzean control society. I think we've moved towards kind of epidermal biopolitics, where it's the focus on the skin with this as well. But one of the other things that I'm working on in this book, there's another chapter on the conjunction between natural sensation and machine sensing, so which includes machine vision and other kinds of things as well. But there's some work with some of the nanotech and bioengineering guys at UC that we're looking at, where they've been developing very small, what's called epidermal microelectronics, which are very small, thin, printed, simple electronics that can go on skin. And then the nanotech guys working on different kinds of inks or molecule scale chemicals that that react to environment in particular different ways. And the conjunctions of these together imply kinds of technologies by which what is a natural sensation and what's machine sensing as an augmentation of natural sensation are completely interwoven at a very, very low level. And that's very interesting to me in terms of the instrumentalization of skin. I mean, on the one hand, you can think of, tools like these could be used to measure, to sense things that are going on in the ambient environment that we couldn't sense, like how much, nicotine is in the air, whatever, right? Or something that's going on your person. What's the pH in my sweat if I'm diabetic? But the more interesting thing, of course, is being able to mediate kinds of physical skin-based sensation that we've never felt before. Okay? When you think about it, like in terms of 19th century, with cinema, we've developed. With cinema and photography, the capacity to produce forms of image and sight and vision that would be otherwise impossible to see. Yeah? Slowing time down, speeding it up, double exposure, so forth and so on. Cuts. With recorded music, with recorded tape, we were able to do the same thing with sound. Skin being our largest sensory organ, we haven't really had technologies that allow us to transform or augment or innovate what it is possible to sense and feel. So this is a sort of one of the areas within this thing that we're kind of looking on. So no, I don't think the idea of skin goes away. I think an older idea of skin goes away. To the contrary, I think the skin itself becomes of primary importance in ways that it may not have before. It's a form of sensing the world that we share with other kinds of inorganic machines that will allow for a correspondence or compatibility between our experiences of the world that I think will be a very important way of thinking. Sensing it, instead of the Kantian idea we have sensing and then thinking happens subsequently, we beginning to understand sensing as thinking and thinking as sensing in a way in which these are combined. I think that would be proved to be very important. Yeah. Or at least, yeah, potentially. Yeah, please.
I understood about 5% of what you said.
Okay,
It's a
that's
completely new discourse for me. I was wondering, but I thought it was really interesting and worth understanding more.
Thanks.
Have you ever tried to explain what you're doing and thinking to children, and are they more capable of understanding? Because somehow, I even noticed my son, who's 11, understands more almost instinctively about machines than my daughter who's 20 understands. So I'm wondering, does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I have a 7-year-old boy, and I try to talk to him a little bit about some of my work. He gets it on the level that he gets it. I mean, I very much, I try to do, I'll write books for academic presses, but then I also do talks in a lot of different kinds of places. I try to make the work accessible without oversimplification. I think one of the problems, real big problems in our just general public discussion about technology and innovation and all the rest of this is that it's become a kind of entertainment platform, right? And I think TED is kind of a case, this sort of main example of this, where the discussion of these things is the idea is it's fantastic if someone's presenting this work and people are entertained by it and it gets them in as well. But when entertainment becomes the end instead of the means, and it begins, and I think you begin to shift the priorities of the discussion as well. I think it's perfectly fine if you understood 5% of it and wanted to go into more. When I go to talks with these neuroscientists and the natural, I understand 5% of it, but I'm really interested in what I get, and I dig in more. I mean, this is learning. I think we should, everyone. There's only 5% of, there's a talk that I would go to with you where I would only understand 5% of it, and you would have to explain it to me. That's fine. That's why we teach each other. And so, yeah, I think we're all capable of having this discussion. I hope so.
I think
Yeah.
that children are just,
Better at it?
well, I'm wondering about it. I mean, my son's really into manga. Some of what you were explaining, I thought, when he's trying to explain manga to me, it sounds similar.
Well, different parts of it, I think. Probably some of the things that are dealing with some emerging technologies, it may seem less emerging to them. That's the way things are. When you touch screens, they do something, right? This is so novel, whereas some of the other, but the book in this work really is, I hope is clear, it's not just a story about technology. It's a book about political philosophy, design theory. It's a book about a lot of things that are much older, that are much, that don't change at the same pace, but remain foundationally important to the way in which we want to work. And I don't think my son would have the same level of facility with this as well. Yeah, but I think I think part of it is a problem in the way in which we separate these things. You could get a degree at a research university in an arts department and have no idea what's going on in any of these scientific laboratories across the hall from you. You can go to medical school and not know how to program. I think there's a disciplinary and intellectual paranoia at work that is absolutely unaffordable at this point. And so I'm very interested in finding ways to plug these things into one another.
So there's philosophy without human consciousness, then?
Oh, well, it has been.
Reconnect what he was asking.
Most philosophy is about human consciousness, I think. I think the percentage of human philosophy that's about human consciousness is small. Philosophy of mind, you call it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, please. As many as I'm here till tomorrow, so I can say.
I don't want to.
You don't want to. You don't.
I don't want to be rude.
Okay, so
but
he'll be the bad
we
guy.
have
That's
to-
fine.
We have to
Yep.
switch. It's so precious to have you here, but
Sure.
also I have to be
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah.
economist.
Yeah.
And I have to announce Ines Dujak.
Okay, okay. I'll get it away.
And you will be open.